Everybody, Edo here, and I am excited today because I have Steve Finn on the line. Say hello, Steve.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Ed.
No problem. Obviously, your background's a little cooler than mine. My family has taken over the dining room table, so I am upstairs. But we can still have this conversation. So we have a game coming to Kickstarter.
Yes,
The Whatnot Cabinet, June 2nd. And one of the interesting things that comes up with all of these games we've worked on together and with Beth Sobel, the artist, is around sort of this, how you guys do such a great job on the look and feel and how the art is integrated into the game, and it's such a showcase of Beth's beautiful artwork, and how do you go about it, and, you know, is Steve the designer, and then Ed, what do you do, and we have all these like questions, and I thought this one was as interesting as all the rest, so I figured we could talk about it, because I do think many people just assume the way that games are designed is just like the designer pitches a prototype and the publisher picks it up and then there's development. But at least the way we've made these games have been different.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So I thought it'd be interesting. We'll see. So much like Herbaceous, right, where Beth had posted some art online and I looked at it and I was like, oh, that art should be in a game. Is it in a game? She's like, it was a retheme, but whatever, let's do it. And then I approached you after working on Herbaceous and Sunset Over Water and Herbaceous Sprouts. We were talking about like what the next game would be. And all of that started with us, between you, me, and Beth, just saying like, hey Beth, what do you want to draw? Like, what would be fun to draw? And I think she had a list of like 3 interesting things. You had a list of like 3 interesting things. Things like people, landscapes. It was similar to what we did with Sunset Over Water. Objects. And at the time, I don't know if it was all original or not, but she was basically like, well, here's a portrait I've done in the past. Here's an object I did on a card. Here's a thing. And we were looking at it. And we lined up into like, well, a game about pretty little objects seems like, a fun idea. And so at that point, that's when the challenge began, right? So I guess what I'm just trying to, like, it was like, we are going to make a game all about collecting little objects. And we want them to be pretty. They need to be a piece of art. I don't know if we were tiles at that point or cards or something, but like, we're going to be collecting these small little things. What are you going to do with it? And then it was like, hey, Steve, have some fun, right?
Right.
And it has been a while. With COVID and other things, this game is coming out a little later than intended. But in terms of like approaching a problem and saying, all right, I got a bunch of little pieces of art on the table and objects, do you recall some of the sort of things that you initially thought of or approached towards it, I guess?
Well, as I mentioned, before we started this video to you, I have a hard time remembering details, and I make a lot of games. And since that time that we started this game, I've been making, I probably have 5 or 6 other games. But I do, there's a general thing that happens with you and I in this whole process.
Sure.
And you kind of give me that direction and you just say, go in this direction. And I'm like, all right, where am I going to go with this? And I know, like, with Herbaceous and Herbaceous Sprouts, you kind of give me these general ideas. And, so the general idea, if I recall correctly, it was pretty objects, like you mentioned, and obviously set collection. And I know this came up because I had been wanting to make a game about collecting different kinds of books and putting them on a bookshelf.
And
there's books out there, I think, like, but it wasn't in a monastery this time. But it was just like, what I wanted to do was kind of, this goes back to my little flower shop, which we didn't do together, but my company did. There was this idea in my mind about making different games about the different things in my town. And there's a flower shop in the town, a coffee shop, it's a Starbucks, but there's also a local one. I don't live in a very big town at all. It's very small. It's a hamlet. Technically. And there's a bookstore, and I said it would be cool to like have a game that was named after this bookstore about putting books on shelves in a bookstore. right? And so I think when you came along with that idea of like collecting objects, the initial thoughts that I had about how I would make a game about putting books on a shelf was already in my mind.
Right.
And so I said, oh, you know what, this idea that I have, about set collection, and I had it, it's just like, how are we going to arrange the objects? Because you can arrange them in two different ways, usually by alphabetically, by the title, or by the author, or by type.
Right.
So that's how we got to colors and type of object.
Yeah, and there was. Go ahead. Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I think that was actually a pretty good recollection because I remember those conversations. But I think what was interesting was, right, there's that direction. Hey, as a player, I want to collect small, beautiful things. I want to, and like a natural step of collection is set, inherent to collecting. You're set collecting. Like that's like almost like the standard mechanic for that. But the interesting challenge up front that we started grappling and when we were talking about, you were like, well, maybe they're tiles on a grid or objects in a grid, was how can we conceive and think about, like, inherently to sets, you're going to have things that are the same color, same shape, same material, but at the same time, we wanted to have this game where it's showcasing Beth's art as uniquely as possible. So then we sort of went through this collaboration with Beth around, hey, like in what ways, because you could say color, you could say size, you could say, but like size was limiting because they were all in the same shape. They were all supposed to be small, right? But color, material, at some point we were talking about like time period, like medieval, like that kind of age. It could be clothing, and then like how can we think about it in a way that offers a range to Beth, but still enough clear organization for a player that they're never confused about, oh, that is a shell, that is a leaf, that is an animal, right? Like, and how to do that. And initially, it was interesting because we were going back and forth. Beth was super involved in this place because it was really about how can we like do something that really allows her to do the art she wants to do, but still fits the constraints of the design, right? And I remember I had thought that allowing for material like metal, rock, paper, like silver, like that kind of thing, would give Beth more range than color. Like I just felt like color would be a little bit restrictive because you're like, it's got to be all of one color. And she was like, oh no way, please don't make me do materials, let me do color. And I was and she had because from her vantage point, I don't want to speak for her exactly, but there was this large, like there are a lot of things in objects you collect that really do have a base color, and she just felt that she could drive that better. And we were like, all right, whatever you say, Beth, we're going to do it.
Right, but that's it's an interesting point because while you're talking to Beth, because it's kind of, you're the middle person.
Sure.
Even though I was in some of the emails as well. Like, this is why you and I have this collaboration, because you think of those kinds of things, and I think of I was basically this. I need, for the mechanics to work, I need two characteristics.
Right.
I don't care what they are. You figure it out. You talk to Beth. You do that. And, so it could have been anything. I didn't care. And that's kind of the way I am. It's like the mechanics, I had it already mostly set up that, I was doing, in my prototypes, I was just doing, what the hell was I doing? Colors and gems. I think I had it for a while, so it was like,
the early versions were just...
The very early version was just two things, and so, but this is one of the things that you and I kind of do is I have most of the mechanical things set up is about, what kind of game you want. So I just say, do you want a set collection game? Do you want push your luck? How long a game do you want? how big, and like, so a lot of the things is you setting out the parameters. And I know with this game, we wanted to make a smaller box.
We missed. We
missed. That's the intention, right? But that's funny because a lot of times, people say to me, like, what do you think about first? And often I say box size.
Yeah.
Because as a self-publisher, that's one of the first things I have to think about is like, what can I fit into the box? What kind of box size am I going to have? How am I going to mail? As someone who used to, and maybe you don't do this anymore, and I don't do it as much anymore, although I did it this week when I had a sale. Like when you're the one sticking the games in the
I still stick games in boxes, man.
USPS boxes, you're thinking, what size is this going to be? How much does the post office charge? Right? So
the weight and all that stuff.
The weight and all that kind of stuff. So it's like, what size box are you going to have? And, and so there's that consideration. And there's all these things that go into design, even the mechanics that start from outside of the production. Like what we're going to produce.
Well, and the way I think about it, and I think it's the balance, I generally speaking think of it as a product. Right, it's a game, but it's a game that's sold in a store and or on Kickstarter, and so it's everything inclusive, which includes the opening the box experience and the pulling it out and the rules and all those points. I think there was two interesting points you sort of rolled through there in reverse order here. One was, we did miss. So initially, the Whatnot cabinet, we were working very hard to make it fit into the Herbaceous and Sunset Over Water box. This was the third in that small box line. We had done Sprouts, but Sprouts was bigger, and it was going to be another one of that smaller size. And a lot of work went into making that possible. The cabinets fitting in that size, the layout, the tiles fitting in the cabinets all fit in there. Like, I have lots of samples where I'm like laying out all the tiles. But then slowly on that process, it's got the tiles, it's got the rules. I Pencil First Games, I like meeples, and we at some point, I think it was Kim, who's the graphic designer, who's a big part of all this too, and I'll mention her again a couple times. Right. But I was like, what are we gonna do for these meeples? Are they gonna we did people for Sunset Over Water? So like the obvious answer was objects. But then if they're objects, you're collecting objects, and that doesn't make sense. And then they're basically bags, like you're the backpack, you're the satchel, and then it feels Monopoly. And I think at some point Kim was like, what about doing like a classic pawn? And she like sent me some images of these old from like games from the 70s. When you open up the Whatnot cabinet, you'll see these pawns, and they're like rounded pawns. And
they're cool.
Yeah, they're super cool.
Yeah.
And so we're like, we got to do those, and they feel like little objects you'd keep, right? Which makes it stand out to me. So then we have the pawns, and then there's like, is a pile as good as a bag here? We're gonna have a bag, and then suddenly you're trying to close the lid on that box,
right?
And you're like, well, if there's no insert, and we just put it all in like that, but you're like, it's a mess, and so then we're like, well, what about moving to a bigger box? Is the game there? You got to think about the game weight and all that. But that was a much more correct spacing and sizing, and it works much better. Though, like, talk about a normal conversation with design. One thing you'll notice when you open the Whatnot cabinet, this box, the pawns, all the cards, but you'll see that the rule book is the size of a Herbaceous or Sunset Over Water rule book.
That's right.
It's because it was like, it's beautiful, it's clear, it all works, and the idea of like, oh, let's completely redo this rule book to be full, like it's just a great rule book. It's fine, we're not touching it.
But the insert makes it look like the rule book was designed to be there.
Yeah,
so without having this conversation, I don't think anybody would have had a problem with it.
The 200 people who are going to see this, they'll know our secret.
Yes.
But then there's other little things that come out with, just to talk about Kim for a second, in that middleman process. So there was Beth figuring out her stuff, but then also, like, for example, then we're like, well, if we're using colors, we have to deal with colorblind type of situations, right? And, that's where there's this like colorblind language system you can find online. It's like icons for colorblindness. And we were using those, and then I found out you had to license it for like a ton of money in your products to use it, and I was like, But then we came up. Kim came up with the idea. I think it was Kim, or maybe we're discussing it, of the idea of cutting off the banners in different ways to represent the different colors. And so it's all sort of finding those solutions. To go back to the design for a second, one of the things I thought was really interesting. So, first version, gems. Picking gems, organizing gems. That's where we started having this conversation. One big conversation in this game was how many colors and types? Like, is it 5x5, 6x6,
Right.
7, 4x4? Not the size of the like 4 types by 4 colors or 5 types by or some combinations. That was a big question. As was, what size grid are you filling? Is
Right.
it a square? Is it 4x4? And I'm pretty sure a lot of the earlier ones weren't. It wasn't 3x4. I think we were 4x4.
I think it was 4x4. Yeah.
And so that conversation gets into that sort of what's the feel of the game, what's the length of the game, what's the analysis paralysis of the game, and we had a lot of back and forth at that point around like, man, I feel like and actually it's funny, it's not out yet, but Rado is going to do a review, and he mentions one aspect of the game in there where as you're building out your tiles in your space, you just place them anywhere in the cabinet. You don't have to like grow.
Right.
I'm pretty sure the earlier version you had was a little bit more like once you place, you have to place next to. There was some point with the design. I don't remember which version 1, 2, 6, 7, 50. One version which was like, I think this is just too much, man. Like the amount of things I got to carry in my head right now and making these decisions was like really big. And it's meant to be, and this is where knowing your product is so important. It's meant to fit in this line that you can teach to anybody, right? Every one of these games I've taught my mother, who doesn't play many games at all, how to play. And you want to be able to explain it quickly and play it quickly and not have it sort of weigh you down. So that's always a conversation we have when we're talking about it. Yeah, just to get to the designer side, when you think about how to lighten a game, do you have an idea of what are some go-to things you do, or?
Oh, well, it's a lightning game. I actually want to just point out one thing about how that decision to go down to a 3x4 also just happened to work out well with something.
Sure.
So I'm not going to answer. Remind me of that question in a second, because you were talking and I just realized how, like, in the process of designing something, things just end up making more sense. And as people who will look at the rules will discover, when you fill when you fill a column, you could score either 2 or 4 points. And when you score a row, you score 1 or 3. And so I think that difference between a row and a column scoring is important. And whereas if we had a 4x4 grid, it wouldn't make sense. The variety of different kinds of scores doesn't make as much sense. If you have a 4x4 grid, why would a column be worth more?
Right.
And if it weren't worth more, then it would have the same, it would just be 2 and 4, right? So by switching over to that smaller cabinet, not only did we make the game shorter, but it also just makes the point values make more sense in the context of the game. So I just like how when one solution provides another solution, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I wasn't even thinking of that, but now look at this. Oh, this works out great. Those moments in game design are the moments that I love, where I try something new and I realize it solves multiple things at one time.
Yeah, all the problems. And actually, we're going to forget the old question.
Right.
We can come back to it, but that reminds me of the next thing we faced, which at that point there may have been a couple. I think it was just scoring your grid. This sort of all the same, all different sort of set collection scoring and ors, like Quirkle type of thing. And everyone had the 4x4 grid, and there were no gold cards. There was nothing. It was just that, and maybe there were ones with the crown on it you had a star or something for the extra point. But you were just, and I remember the conversation. We're playing the game. It was sort of like, well, we're all min-maxing basically for the same thing, and it's like, yeah, it was like everyone could have the best top score. Like there was a perfect board, which was different colors by same colors by same shapes, and if you got that board, you were tied for first. and it was very, and maybe you have a crown, somebody else does, or you messed up, but there was like this like perfect board, and it worked mechanically, it worked, but it lost the sense of identity in collection. Like it lost the sense of like, I'm making my little board here and you're making yours, and we're not. It was sort of like Azul, and not that Azul's a bad game, but like there's everyone's doing almost the exact same thing as far as and you could flip it over and do the other side, but like at the end of the day, the perfect boards all look sort of the same, right? And but there's more depth to Azul in terms of like how you get there. But anyway, so we were thinking about that, and it was like, how can we have this column and row scoring, which was working, right? There's a lot of stuff when you're doing game design where it's like, this works, this mechanic, I like this mechanic, don't mess with this mechanic. But how can it be like, no, I did this or I did that? And I think that's when you're like, well, what if there were some goal cards? And I think at first the goal cards were like not positional. It was like maybe 2 rows of this or this many colors or something. But then along the way you added goals like, no, you have in the 4 corners or 5 of the same type, or like things that like you could go for that would force you to start making versions that didn't look like everyone else's.
Right.
I don't know if that was related to other designs you had done in the past, but I felt like that was a big step for the game where it just had a lot more personality once people stopped all making the same min-max decisions.
Right. Well, what's happening now too? It's so many roll and write games, and I mean, there's a lot of games out there now where there's everybody just takes the same action, creates their own board, or whether it's a roll and write or like Karuba that everybody's doing the same thing. And there's a lot of criticism about there not being a lot of interaction. Right. So when you have something like that, I mean, I'm sure I didn't make this up, the idea of goal cards from myself. I'm sure like in all of the games that I play and all the different games I have, it's just a pretty standard thing to do to have goals. And that's how you can create interaction. So,
but just for those who haven't played, an important point here is that these goal cards are first to get them takes it cards, right? They're not we all have the same goals forever. The interaction you're talking about is that sort of race to get that goal. And then, he got the 4-corner goal before I did. Now I can't do it anymore. But go on.
Right. And like with the, the King Domino action selection, which is what essentially, our main board is, it's not exactly the same, but you choose better turn order at the cost of getting a worse tiles. Right. And so King Domino has that kind of thing, except that you're just picking the tiles. Here you're also picking a special power, in some case, like sweeping it and putting out new things. So you get that as well. But that also creates a little interaction. So I think a lot of a key thing when you have everybody's constructing their own, whatever it is, their own kingdom, their own flower shop, their own whatever, there has to be something that allows for interaction. So I don't know if the game that I think most similarly that I have that involves that would be the little flower shop.
Right.
But that doesn't really involve a lot of. There's no interaction. There's no common goal. At least in the base version, there's no common action goals. And the interaction comes from like Sushi Go kind of drafting, right? Yeah. Let's go back to where were we at?
No. We gotta roll with it. I think everyone can live without that other answer. Yes. They ask in the comments. But no, actually, because that's another major design point I want to talk about is that action selection board.
Right.
And this is a place where I thought we had another interesting, because in some ways, not only is the Whatnot cabinet, it's part of this journey of these products where, like, to some degree, I'm sort of like, I assume you've played Herbaceous. I assume you've played Sunset. I assume you play, because, like, we have an audience that likes these games, and I like them too. And so The first version, once we at some point you were dealing with the action select, like how we do different actions, and the solution you had, which you've done in a number of games, is your action selection initiative thing, right? So in you have it in the flower shop, you just have a number. It came, which is your not the flower shop, the butterfly garden uses it,
Right.
And then you brought that into Sunset Over Water. We tweaked it a little bit to time, so it's when you wake up. But this idea of like we're all gonna play and we're gonna like see who has the number, who has the advantage. And I don't remember it exactly, but with the way you had this game initially set up was like everyone has their 4 action cards and you play one and it determines who goes first and you pick and then everyone resolves, right? Just to have changing turn order that's quickly resolved is what that's good for, right? Among other things. And weighting the value of actions to initiative. But like I remember playing it and it wasn't wrong, but it was just sort of like, I don't want to make another game with a deck of cards that's choosing my turn order. Like I feel like that's Sunset Over Water. Let's not do that in the Whatnot cabinet. And that's a weird one where it's like, hey, you have a mechanic that works, and the only reason I'm saying no to this mechanic is it's like what we did in our last game, not anything, And so,
yeah, but that's a legitimate. I think that's a legitimate concern. You don't want to just keep reusing the same thing. I mean, I'm doing it again though in Mining Colony coming up soon, right? There's going to be that.
No, you have like 4 mechanics, 5 mechanics you really like, Steve, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of, I know. But that's the thing is, these are all quick, short games, but despite the fact that they keep reusing mechanics, I think, our goal is to still try to combine them in ways that are fresh, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it's because, I think the collaborative effort works really well in this case because I might sometimes be satisfied. Like, hey, this is working. I like it, right? But then you're not, and that's where it actually, it's funny. There's times where I have to be pushed to do the right thing. So I'll just give you an example. I'm working on a game right now, obviously, and it's a roll and write to Biblios, and I'm playing it over, Tabletopia, and I'm playing with a friend of mine, and he basically said something like, a lot of people want another side of this board. So everybody has their own board. But for replayability, have a different thing on the other side. And I didn't want to do it because I was like, oh no, I got to now test it more. And it was working, and now I got to work, now I got to try this whole new thing. And I'm so happy he told me and forced me to do that, and you do the same kind of thing. You basically say, I like it, it's working, but, and there's what's going to come after the but. And, in that particular case, it was a good decision, that we ended up getting away from that. The other thing is, I even remember, I think you were talking about cutting down on the components. So you just said, well, that requires a deck of cards. Right. So, sometimes what happens when you and I design, this is really, I think, for people listening, because the question I get a lot is, what does Ed do? And because we know what Beth does, and we know you kind of design the things. What does Ed do? And I say, well, are you a co-designer or not? And I do say you're a co-designer. What I usually say is you, and this isn't always the case, but you don't usually get in the real weeds so much, but really just have it kind of says something general like, I don't know if I want cards, or, you need to make this move a little quicker, rather than, why don't you try this specific thing? You do that, but that's not the main thing that you do. That's not your primary contribution, right?
Well, yeah, I think for my part, one, I think when you're working with somebody who's better at what they do than you are, let them do their job, right? this is for all products, right? I consider myself a generalist. You're a specialist. It's like I might give Beth feedback, and I have, and she's she's fantastic at what she does. But sometimes it's like the size. We're not really. It's more of this kind of a size thing, or we've done a bunch of those. It's not terribly dissimilar. And sometimes she's like, oh, okay, and she'll do the other thing, or she'll be like, no, I don't. I think it's fine the way it is, Ed. and then
Right.
just like you. But I think that was an interesting decision too, though, because we wanted to reduce components, but it was like, hey, everyone could have cards, but if we do an action selection aboard, it's a central thing, and now we get meeples. And at the time, they were meeples, and like meeples is a showcase item. Cards aren't really, especially if they're not like the tiles.
They just have numbers on them.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Right.
And that's relevant because like I do think about Kickstarter, I do think about the products, and I do think about like what was memorable. And now the game has a memorable component you can hold in your hand that's tactile that goes with all the beautiful art that Beth has put together. But
you're talking about the pawns there?
Yeah,
you're talking about the board. Yeah, but see, here's the other thing too: is like when we were talking about designing this. A couple months ago we were working on the co-op game. That really didn't go anywhere. But you had basically said we need an excuse, right, to have the artwork out there.
Right.
And so this board does provide. I mean, it provides a function. But this is the way that things come together in the design world when you're trying to make a game. Is and just that line. We need an excuse to make good art.
Right.
Right? I mean, it sounds like in one way that you're just making up something. So I don't want to make it sound like that. But it led me, it is helping me as also, publishing my own games. I say, all right, how can I also showcase art?
Right.
What kind of things can I have here that can showcase art? And the player board, unlike cards, does that, and it has a table presence, and I think that's important.
Table presence is a huge part of it, but to sound maybe a little bit more artistic and game maker like than business. The other thing it's doing is it's an opportunity to express the theme of your game in a way that allows people to get more engaged and excited about it. So the board at first is the mechanics, but then as we're talking through this, like, what am I doing? I'm just set collecting. It's like, well, no, you're going on a journey. And on the top of the board, on the left side is your house. And now we have the space to show your house. And as you're picking spots further away, you're further away from your house. We're not telling you you're leaving home, but it gives a little bit of like, oh, I'm somebody going out and collecting things, right? And I think it's the same thing with a minor example of it, which we've talked about in Sunset Over Water, the little difference between, hey, whoever has 14 at the bottom of their card goes before 16.
Right.
Versus whoever has 6 a.m. goes before 9 a.m. or the person who woke up at noon creates like a instant understanding of what's happening. Oh, whoever woke up first goes first. Like that just... It's not that different than whoever's the lowest number goes first, but like it connects and then resonates into jokes at the table. It resonates into like, oh, I slept in, right?
Yes.
And like, not that, but so those little things can help draw people into your game mechanics if the theme is expressed in the language and how it works with the mechanics. But so when we switched to that board, King Domino was a great example. All of the games by, Bruno Cathala, right? Like if you look at there are all these games. But I do think what was really nice about how you and so this is a place where, to that question, what does Ed do? I wasn't like, here are the actions, it was just but what I thought was really interesting how you did it was, it's got the like, I'm making a choice, but this really wonderful value proposition between choosing to go first the next round and having this less surety in what you're going to select versus the end, which is go last next round, but you get to you're going to see what's out there and then you can wipe it and see what else is you can just replace everything there. Is a really great tension, and it works in the solo version of the game. It works with 2 players where we have double pawns. So
there's one other thing too. I mean, I'm just going to interrupt it, and just while I'm thinking about it, because as soon as something goes in my mind, it could be gone before I end the sentence. But where I remember you actively participating in a more detailed way, and that was the number of options.
Oh, sure.
Right. So the board has 5 options. It's a 4-player game, and that means the last person will have an option, and that's not something I have in all of my games, but it is something I do think about. Is, does the last person have a choice to do something? And I've now started to, and this is kind of also in line with the idea of the cabinet having fewer restrictions. In many games since Whatnot Cabinet, I mean, because I've actually designed 5 or 6 since finishing that, I've been moving more towards that attitude of give people more flexibility, let them do more stuff in a short amount of time so that they feel like they've accomplished something. And one good thing about this game is, like, and because I remember we had different versions of that board, and it led to the situation that some people wouldn't finish their cabinet. So there's 3 by 2, there's 12 spots, depending on which early version we were talking about. So some people might finish early, and then because of the number of tiles that we're putting down, some people wouldn't finish their cabinet. And now, and I think, I don't know if that was you, I don't know if it was me, if it came out of the discussion, I can't remember where that came from. But just the idea that everybody gets to finish, and everybody will have a completed cabinet. Now, some will score obviously better than others. So I think that was a very important decision for this game, but also for many of my other games, is give a little bit more choice so that no one is just stuck. I mean, because there's so many games where you go last, you don't have a choice because you didn't choose to get in a better position, right?
Yeah. So those are really, I mean, hopefully this is interesting to the folks who watch it through, right? But like, I think
it's interesting to us. I might rewatch this.
Yeah, I think
all the great things you're saying.
Yeah, I think it speaks to, because this one, I think one of the important things that why I thought this would be so interesting was Herbaceous was like, I was like, hey Steve, I couldn't get the solo thing done. You're like, I don't do solo, I do multiplayer. I was like, give it a shot. And you handed over Herbaceous, and I was like, oh, this game's like done. Like, I think maybe we tweaked it a little bit, like card count or number of herbs or whatever. Right. But it was like close. And I think even Sunset Over Water was pretty close, and it was working out the thematics, and it was working out some of the sizes, but like you basically presented something pretty close there. It was like, how much should I move? Are we moving too much as players? But the premise was pretty close. Sprouts was interesting in that we spent tons of time working on, like, that was like, I want to roll dice. I want this to be a dice rolling game. Right. But it can't be simpler than Herbaceous. Because nothing's simpler. And so we spent all this time talking about the dice, and then once the dice were solved, then everything sort of folded in. I think Whatnot Cabinet really was a ton of iteration, because like you're talking about the adding the 5th column. That was, I was just playing the game constantly, the version, the prototypes, and like you're playing it, and it was just sort of like it was often the case that somebody 1 time, 2 times in a row basically didn't get a decision on their turn. Basically, it was like, oh, I guess I'm in that spot. Oh, I guess I'm in that spot. And like that just sort of sucks as a player, right?
Right.
And so it was like, well, what can we do about that? And it was like, well, what if there was, it's actually, you didn't add the 5th spot, you added the first spot. Originally, yes. It was like, draw 1 random, pick 1, and then you added this, just draw everything 2. And just and then it's like, oh, I always have a choice, and and sometimes it's only between 2 things, but that made a really big difference.
It also added, drawing 2 random tiles does add luck into it, but it also, I mean, for a 20-minute game. And this is the other thing, is how much luck do we want? It adds that just moment of, either or real happiness or like, oh, this is terrible.
Yeah.
So there's a big element of risk.
Yeah.
There's a huge element of risk, especially at the end of the game, to take that pass.
Yeah. And I completely agree. And it's a nice, it allows for those moments, right? It allows for that. There are different types of elation you can give to a player or fun, and I think that sense of wonder and for lack of a better term, the gambling sort of push your luck, like I think is just like a dice. Rolling dice is another great example of like that's just joyful and just you see it's kinetic and but the other one you mentioned, I think was another huge one, which is this idea of like not everyone finished their board, because it used to be that like there was the stuff in the middle, and if it ran out or you only added enough, like you wouldn't get as many, like that. It had to do with what you were selecting, how many options you got, and and this was more I think when it was a 16 4x4, but you might not finish. And then like we were spending all this time thinking about rules for like what happens when you weren't finished.
Right.
Does the other player still draft? Do you keep going around? Because like Herbaceous isn't a game, for example, that sort of has this problem where somebody can finish the game. They can do all their pots.
Right.
And in that one, I think, and it works really well in Herbaceous, we're like, no, just keep going around. And part of the reason that works is there's so much power in what you put in front of you and what you put in the middle.
Right.
That for the extra 2 rounds of play, that's all you can do. You get the sort of hate drafting. You get the ability to be like, oh, I'm going to keep this, saffron, and you're not going to get it or whatever, or lavender. But in the Whatnot cabinet, there was this sense of like, I'm getting robbed of my moment with my final cabinet, right? Like I don't get to see it and feel like, no, I have a cabinet. The other thing that I think I would take forward in other games is, and this has come up when reviewers ask questions or clarifications, the ability, and we have this in the rules, to say every turn, no matter what, you will end with 2 new tiles on your board.
Right.
Like, helps solve so many problems. Like, did that mean that? Did you end up with 2 tiles? Oh, okay.
Right.
Or did I get 2? Like, even when you're playing, like somebody might have done a special action card and sweeped and add 1. It's like, if you don't have 2 new tiles, and they're even.
Something went wrong.
Something went wrong.
Yes.
And I think that was powerful. And then it was great because in the two-player game is super fast. Right. Because you basically double your action, so you get like basically 4 a round instead of 2 a round. But like same sort of thing. It's like turn, turn, turn. So I think that worked out well. Trying to think if there were other little. So we talked about the board, the pawns, the tiles. At some point we ended up talking about language and discard versus keeping tiles versus losing tiles. We went through the process of like, should there be a harder, a little bit more cutthroat version of the game, right? Which is we let you subtract out 1 set of tiles. That then you put a little icon on the back of the tile so that you just have, there's less variability, for lack of a better term, which I thought was good. Trying to think if there are any other big sort of shifts or twists we did, and I think that covers most of them. The original question that got missed, just so we don't totally spoil it, was just when you're thinking about how to make when you're thinking about
shorter.
A 40-minute game or a 20-minute game, like what are some of the things you're thinking about on like how to keep it the brevity that you, because you've gotten the king of filler.
Right. Well, yeah. So what's interesting for me is I play fast, and I play with a lot of people, for the most part, who play quickly and make decisions quickly. So, like, I'll play a game, and it'll be 20 minutes, and then I'll go to a convention, or I'll go to a play test, and I'll give it to other people, and they take, like, twice as long. I'm like, oh, my God, how can I do this? This is nowhere as quick as I want it to be. So, I mean, the trick, a lot of times, well, with this game, it was very easy. Just make the board smaller, right? I will always, like, say, how can I make the rounds, just cut down the rounds even when I feel like it should go on longer, because I'm always off because of how fast I play games myself.
Right.
Because I am not subject to analysis paralysis. I do not sit there and think, what if I do that, if I do that? I go with my gut. I used to play a lot of chess, but I never played long chess. I play speed chess blitz with the clock.
Yeah, that's fun.
And and when I play games, when I play speed chess, I'm usually not thinking, what will happen, that happen, that happen, then that happens. But instead, I just say, how's my general position? And I might think 1 or 2 moves ahead, but I'm not thinking like 6 moves ahead. And I take that attitude when I play board games, where I don't want to get overwhelmed. And so I try to make games that don't have that overwhelming aspect. But when I know they're subject, like the Whatnot cabinet can lead to lots of, in a short amount of time, there's still a lot of things to think about, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, no, I think that's true. And I think with
so it's just like, yeah. So I mean, to answer the question, in this case, it was make the board shorter. That was very easy. But in most times, it's just, if I have a game with rounds, it's just make it 2 rounds shorter. I mean, I'm making Biblios roll and write game now that I've mentioned already, and I'm not doing it just to plug the game. But it's actually a game I'm thinking about because I'm putting the final touches on. And I had it originally as 10 rounds. Then I cut it down to 8. I really wanted to make it 7, so it would be a week.
Yeah.
But I have to go with 8 because 7 was just too short. And it's all about, a lot of what I do is all about just streamlining it more. How can I streamline it even more? And I think, you... in our collaborative process, the games, it's not surprising to me that most streamlined games, some of the ones I've made, are with you, because you help. Like, even more. Like, how can we make this even shorter?
and certainly with this one, they've been almost every one of these was like, can we cut the cards in half? Do we need that many? Can this be shorter? Like. And it's definitely a thing that I think you think about probably more than a lot of designers I've worked with in terms of like, can the game be shorter? And I think that's very at odds with how I think a number of designers think about games. And I think it's a little bit like, how can somebody come to the table, have some fun, feel smart, engage with other people, but not get stuck, not feel heavy, and be able to play another thing or do another thing, And I think, I mean, in some ways, like, I think the Whatnot cabinet embodies that very much, right? You play it like you got to learn at the first game, but then you're like, oh, this is a fast game, like it goes right by. But you do feel like you have all those choices. You feel like you played something. It didn't just happen.
Right.
But talking about things not going long, we're at 45 minutes. I
probably
think
a good time to stop.
Yeah, I think we've.
I will just say one thing though.
Sure.
In the Rado review video that for this game, he said that Jen, right after playing, said that he wanted to play again, and I think that's one of the things that leads me to always want to cut down the game, because my first most popular game, Biblios, a lot of people say they'll play it 4 times in a row.
Right.
Now, if a game is 45 minutes long, no one's going to do that.
Right.
I don't think I've ever played a 45-minute game and then said, let's play it again. But there's a lot, so I think it's an important thing to think about is, like, do you want people to, like, end the game and say, let's just play one more time? Yeah. And I think that's the purpose behind streamlining it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the Whatnot cabinet delivers on that. And it, again, everyone can judge, but from what he said, seems like she enjoyed it and he enjoyed it too. So anyway, let's wrap. Thank you so much. I can't wait for all your other future designs, and hopefully people get to enjoy this one as much as we did.
Yeah, well, we're going to have to talk about our next future design at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Talk to you later.
All right. See ya.
Hey, everybody. Edo here, and thanks for watching Gaming with Edo. Reviews over here on this playlist, League and Insider videos over here on this one. Subscribe, share, all that good stuff. But most importantly, play some great games. Thanks.